This is Friday, December 4th, 2020. This interview for the Veterans Oral History Project, based in Natick, Massachusetts, is being recorded via Zoom. My name is Maureen Sullivan, Project Coordinator, and we're pleased to have with us today Roger M. Woodbury. Welcome, Roger.
Thank you.
May I ask when you were born?
I was born on January 29th, 1944.
And where were you born?
I was born in Haverhill, Massachusetts.
And where do you currently live?
I live in Morrill, Maine.
And where is Morrill?
Morrill is 10 miles west or inland from Belfast in the mid-coast area.
Close to the ironworks.
That's a bit down east from
okay. That. Your marital status?
I'm married.
Do you have children?
I do. I have a son who lives in Western Massachusetts and a daughter who lives in Southern Virginia.
Any grandchildren?
I have a grandson and 3 granddaughters. 2 of them are in college, hard to believe. And actually 3 of them are in college, and although she's also working as a veterinary technician, and the 3rd one is graduating from high school, I believe, this year.
Mm-hmm. Time flies, you know.
I'm getting old.
So before the interview, you mentioned that you were a student at Natick High School. When did you move from Haverhill to Natick?
Oh, well, moved from Haverhill to Natick in 1950. My father was an elementary school principal in Haverhill, and we moved to Natick when he became director of elementary education in Wellesley in 1950. So I actually completed the 1st grade in Natick.
Okay, I'm curious. Where did you go to 1st grade in Natick?
I went to the Felchville School. Tell me you don't know what. The Felchville School was on Route 27, just before you went across the Route 9 into what we used to call North Natick. The Felchville School was an old frame 2-story building, probably dating to the 1920s. Had great flavor. It was a wonderful old building, and I remember it to this day. But I was there for the first 4 years, and in the 5th year, they had begun to construct a new building next to it, which was named the Brigadier General Daniel J. Murphy School. And that building, I was supposed to have the 5th grade in that building, but the building was incomplete because of a steel strike. And so, horror of horrors, I had to get on a bus and go up to Bennett Hemingway School for my 5th grade. And we are the only classroom space at the Bennett Hemingway School for us was actually on the stage in the auditorium. And they used to drop the curtain down, and we had the stage as our classroom. And we were there until, I'm going to say we were there until April, I think, and then moved into the new building at Daniel J. Murphy School. About 5 or 6 years ago, I think, my wife and I went to Boston, and while we were there, we also went out to Natick to see what the old haunt was like. And when we went out there, that was the time they were just beginning to tear down the old Natick High School from which I had graduated. And we went by my old house on Overhill Road, and went to see the school, and Murphy School and Daniel J. Murphy School, and I was startled. They're both gone, and now that's just a field, which is, I guess, a dog park. I'm just absolutely stunned.
Yeah, I went to Bacon School for 1 year and St. Pat's for 8. So yeah, we've all been down that road before. So tell me about life in Natick.
Natick was like something out of the something out of the 1930s or 1940s for me when I was little. I lived on at the corner of Overhill Road and Franconia Avenue. Franconia Avenue in those days was only one half of what Franconia Avenue is today. When you went up Overhill Road from Main Street, Route 27, you could make a right turn and go down Franconia Avenue, which was really in those days, it was a little narrow dirt road, mostly dirt road. Or you could go straight up Overhill Road to Park Avenue. I remember I'm surprised vaguely that I remember all of this. And across the street from where you turned right to go down Franconia Avenue, there was an apple orchard. And so when I went to school, to Felchville School, I used to go out the front door of my house, cross Overhill Road, and walk through the apple orchard to Felchville School. It was a beautiful walk. I mean, it was from a time that is almost long forgotten. It was so tranquil and peaceful. It was also safe and secure. So it was a kind of a charming place. I had a bicycle when I was old enough to actually ride one, and I can remember riding up to Walnut Hill, and we used to play cowboys and Indians in the woods across from the foot of the hill that goes up onto where the Walnut Hill School was, up on the top of the hill, and there was a pond there that used to freeze, and I can remember skating on the pond. I would have to say it was just tranquil and peaceful. As I said, the biggest shock that I had up until that time was horror. I was going to have to get on a school bus and leave my little community to go to a great big school someplace else full of people I didn't know. And the riding on the school bus took me quite a while to get used to the idea that was going to have to happen. I was fifth grade. Mm-hmm. Natick Center itself was a nice town. It was quiet. What I remember more than anything else was it was quiet. One of the big events for me in those days was that when I went to the sixth grade was in the center school, which was downtown, was the old Natick High School in the center of town. And again, when my wife and I went back to look through Natick, we found that the old high school, my center school, was gone, completely gone, missing. And so it's changed. Natick has changed a great deal. Of course, it's now really what I would call a small city. The town I live in here in Maine is 800 people.
Wow.
And we have a little general store with 2 gas pumps and a small volunteer fire department. And that's about it. If you blink your eyes and leave them shut for a little bit as you go through the road by my house from town to town, you'll miss it.
Right. So Roger, okay, so you just about finished with Benham Murphy traveling the bus, and you also went to center school. Did you go to Coolidge or Wilson for junior high?
Oh, I went to Coolidge Junior High School. Mm-hmm. Yes, that was my first act of rebellion. In those days, we had assemblies, and after the assembly, we sang the Star Spangled Banner. And at the end of singing the Star Spangled Banner, the school tradition was that they rendered an underhanded salute at arm's length, pointing toward the flag. And this was actually the way that the singing of the Star Spangled Banner was actually done in the 20s and 30s. It was a common tradition, but to me, with my little knowledge of history, which I was beginning to become very important to me, I recognized it as the Nazi salute, and I refused to give it. And I must have been spoken to by half a dozen teachers the day that I did that. And but I made it very clear that I was not going to do that. And they said, well, it isn't really, the hand is up, not down when you do this. And I thought, I don't care. I don't like it. So that was something I remember from Coolidge Junior High School. That plus the fact that I was really glad to get out of there and go to Natick High School, which I did as a freshman.
And what do you remember about your days at Natick High?
I remember my history teachers that I had, especially. I also had a wonderful English teacher by the name of Susan Gray, who came from Bar Harbor originally, and she encouraged me to be inquisitive and to write much more than any other English teacher I had ever had. The most striking memory that I have of academically was a teacher by the name of Emmett Shea. And Mr. Shea was on his way to teaching in college, and I understand he ended up teaching at Worcester College or Worcester State College, is it, or Worcester University now? I don't know, but I believe that's where he completed his career. And he brought us, those of us in that particular class, which was international relations, directly into the college learning experience. And it was an awakening for me. He also made some very potent comments about what he perceived to be the coming Vietnam War. So that was really my introduction to the Vietnam War. I also played trumpet in the band, and if I never have to play trumpet and march in a band again, it'll be too soon. But we did a lot of that, and I went to a lot of football games. Every Saturday afternoon there was a football game, and I remember going to every single one of them, rain or shine. And it was a fine experience. I remember the athletics program. I remember having gym. We had gym every day, and so one period of every day we were doing something in gym, either running or playing some foolish game inside. And I remember it as being particularly brutal. Things happened in our normal gym courses that I don't think would be allowed today. Certainly would not have been allowed when I was teaching. But there was this male competitiveness was fostered. And I did very poorly in gym the first year as a freshman. And then one day, I guess in my sophomore year, I got sort of tired of it. And I don't really remember exactly what had happened, but we were playing some sort of an indoor game during the winter. And I got knocked down and hit my head on the floor, and got up mad and decided that the next time I got a chance to, I was going to deck somebody else. And so I began to start doing that. And I remember getting thrown out of gym quite a lot from there on. And strangely enough, my grades went up. So I'm not sure how that worked, but I got to the point where when I was a senior, I rather enjoyed it. So I can't really say that I had a bad 4 years at Natick High School. There was, like every school experience, there were good parts and there were bad parts.
Mm-hmm.
But I was sorry that I never got a chance to go back to Natick High School and see it one more time, after it was torn down
Roger, when did you graduate from Natick High School?
in June of 1962.
And what did you do after that?
Well, I went to Marietta College in Ohio for 2 years. And then at the end of the second year, I really was not sure that I wanted to continue. I knew I wasn't going to go back to Marietta. That was a fantasy that I had when I was a senior in high school, but I did not belong going to a small town school in the central part of the country. I belonged going to the city somewhere. And my father, who was enormously patient, suggested to me that I take some courses in the summer. And I said, well, oh, sure, all right. So I enrolled in 3 courses at Boston University. Took an economics course. I took a religious history course, and I took a course in, I'm not sure what the third one was, but I took a course by a professor by the name of Warren Tryon. And Warren Tryon was quite a flamboyant character with a history. He had studied in Germany and was fluent in German. And as a student at Harvard, he refused to take their graduate requirement to take German as a second lesson because he was already fluent in it.
Mhm.
And that I remember, that was a story that Emmett Shea told me. At any rate, he was a terrific lecturer, and I was fascinated to go to that summer program, and for the hour and a half, just let myself go and be part of. It was almost like watching a movie. I mean, it was a lecture, but it was surreal, and then I was totally engaged. And at that point in time, I knew that I wanted to be a history major. So I took the courses at Boston University and made application, with my father's encouragement, application to enroll at the College of Liberal Arts at Boston University. And I figured nothing was going to come out of it because my academic performance at Marietta College had been really poor. And I got a call on the first week of September at dinner time. The phone rang while we were sitting down to dinner, and it was the admissions office at Boston University. And they wanted to know if I was going to enroll. And I said, can I? And the woman on the phone said, certainly, we have you have your summer school transcripts. And so you're perfectly suitable to enroll here. Well, they got my summer school transcripts before they got my Marietta College transcripts. And so I was enrolled, and I went to Boston University for the last 2 years, and I graduated in 1966.
All right, so newly minted graduate of Boston University. When did the Air Force come a calling, or did you come a calling on the Air Force?
Oh, we have a long way to go to get there.
Okay. So let's go back to 1966. You're out of BU. What happened next?
Well, we really have to go back to Natick High School.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I was standing in the hallway outside my locker after one particular course, I was talking to my girlfriend of the time, who subsequently became my future wife 30 years later. And one of the things that I told her was that there was no way that I was interested in going to a far off place to be killed by a bunch of people that I didn't know, let alone kill anybody that I didn't know. And there was no way that I particularly was interested in being in the military. There was no tradition in my family to do that. My father had been deferred during World War II. My uncle Lawrence had been a naval officer in the Pacific, and in those days they didn't take both sons in a family. That was after the Sullivans all died. So uh, I had made my declaration and to Michelle, my wife, and but after graduating from high school and having been under a student deferment for 4 years, I knew full well that the draft board had other ideas, and they didn't care about what my protests were when I was still yet a minor child. So I knew that I was going to have to do something. And so my father told me about a federal program called the National Teacher Corps. And under the National Teacher Corps program, you committed 2 years to work in a socially or economically deprived area. And in return for that, you would be under a student deferment and at the same time enrolled in an education program at a local cooperating college or university. So I applied. I had spent a summer working in the inner city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, painting houses one summer when I was in high school. And I rather liked the idea of going into a troubled area because I found it interesting to be in a completely different environment, talking to completely different kinds of people that I'd never seen before. It was very attractive to me. So I applied and was accepted to the National Teacher Corps program, and I was assigned to South Providence, Rhode Island. That summer of 1966, I went to an institute in Providence at Rhode Island College, which is where my master's degree would be taken, and spent some time observing the kinds of children that we would be coming into contact with as student teachers. We would be, in effect, student teachers for 2 years, working under a master teacher. The entire program was designed around trying to find new ways, non-traditional ways, to reach economically and socially disadvantaged children. And what that meant was, and why somebody like me, for example, was selected for the program, was because I had no teacher background at all. I had no teacher training in college at all. So I was a completely non-traditional person who introduced into the educational community. And so I was assigned to Roger Williams Junior High School. I don't think Roger Williams Junior High School was there anymore, but that was a building not unlike Coolidge Junior High School, only probably twice the size. And it was a different experience for me. It was much like when I went to Milwaukee, and then it was almost entirely a Black community. And I found that I seemed to get along with the students very well. I didn't have any reason to judge them. I was there to try to make a positive contribution. And as contrasted to some of the other teachers in the building who had been there some years, who had a completely different attitude toward the students than I did. So I was there for the first year. And then just before Martin Luther King's birthday, I believe, the city of Providence came out with a brand new model school program. And they were putting some of all of the federal assets that they had in the city into this model school program. They were handpicking teachers, handpicking the principal was very carefully selected, and all of the resources, academic resources, books, materials, paper, pencils, all of that, so that everything they had was going into this in a big show for political reasons, because they were concerned about possible social unrest around the time of Martin Luther King's death. So I was selected as the teacher corps representative to go to this program. And I got there thinking, well, good, I could be it'll be interesting because I'm going to be the teacher corps representative. Maybe they'll let me be the history specialist, and I can teach history. This is an elementary school. We had grades 1 through 5, and nice modern building, nice new school building. When I got there, I found out that they already had a history specialist, an established master teacher with a master's degree, and he was going to be this teaching, but they didn't have a science specialist. So I became the science specialist. Now, I had not had any science at all since geology, one semester of geology at Boston University. I had had 2 semesters of biology as a freshman in college, which were all, I did terribly, and they were 8 o'clock courses, 8 o'clock classes, not really, truly. And then I had no mathematics in high school after algebra 2. So all of a sudden I was a science specialist. And I had at least 2 sets of textbooks for each grade from 1 to 5. And I also had something else that was fun. I had a portable laboratory cart, which was like a miniature laboratory with a portable sink and all sorts of chemicals and other potions in it. I think I could have made a nuclear bomb if I had known how. It was this wonderful device. I also had a video tape recorder, a Sony video tape recorder, and a camera with a zoom lens. That was very sophisticated stuff. I don't know how much that equipment worked, but somebody told me, I think at one point, it was probably worth about $5,000 by itself. And I thought, what am I supposed to do with all of this? Because what I learned from the very beginning is that all of the fancy textbooks in the world didn't do any good if the students couldn't read at their level. So we had 5th graders who couldn't read at a 3rd grade level. Some of them not even, and this was a model school program. This wasn't the run of the mill. The run of the mill classes were even worse. So we concentrated on basic kinds of science, talking about how air moved and how things moved through air, such as odor, and kept it very, very simple and very basic. And did a lot of filming in the class with this video cassette recorder, because one of the things that the kids all found fascinating was to see themselves. And it was very short, it wasn't long before I realized that my main goal there was to try to create a warm environment for them in which they felt good about being there, because then they would be open to whatever learning could take place. So we went through that, but by the midpoint in the 2nd year, I realized that I had a choice coming up, because I knew that the draft was getting really warm. That was 1966. And I knew that my life expectancy as an independent person after my teacher corps internship was done was probably over. Well, President Johnson announced that we were teacher corps interns were assets of critical need for the nation. And if we wanted to continue to teach in the local community, and if the local community educational system administration offered us a position, we would receive an occupational deferment. And I was interested. I liked teaching in South Providence. I felt that there was a good thing for me to do there. And then I began to think about some of my students at Roger Williams Junior High School. Some of my 16-year-old boys who were in the 7th grade would be 17 going into the 8th grade, and then they would become draft eligible. And I thought about that a lot because a lot of those boys that I had in my classes at Roger Williams Junior High School had no knowledge of where Vietnam was, what Vietnam was, or what any other place in the world outside of about 400 square blocks of South Providence was. And I thought, I've got some boys in my class here who would pass a military exam and conceivably be drafted and then 8 months later be blown up in the middle of a rice paddy because they came from the wrong side of the tracks or a different side of the tracks than I did. And why am I exempt? What is it that makes me exempt? The fact that I came from Natick or Haverhill or am white or what? And it began to eat at me a little bit. I had 3 job offers in South Providence. I really wanted to stay in the Mary Fogarty School where I had taught, and I would be under the principal there, who was his name was Minakuchi. He was a wonderful guy. He was a World War II pilot, actually. He'd flown aircraft in combat in World War II, and I would have been very content to stay there, but it didn't feel right. There was something wrong with this. So reluctantly, I decided I better explore my other options. So I went to see the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. And the Navy was not at all interested in me at all. It's the only thing that they were interested in was whether or not I was interested in learning how to fly airplanes off of aircraft carriers. And I really didn't see myself flying an aircraft, trying to land an airplane on a boat in the middle of the water. That didn't seem right to me. So I said, no, I guess not. The Army said, holy mackerel, yes, please, we'd be delighted to. Let us give you the qualification test today and see what you could be qualified for. So I said, okay. And I took it, and it was kind of boring. I mean, it was really not very complicated. And I remember that Army Master Sergeant said to me, he said, oh, this is amazing. He said, this is the best test return I've ever received. And I said, what's that? He said, you only got 2 wrong. And I said, which 2? So they were interested, of course, because I was platoon leader material. I was a college graduate, and I still had both arms and legs. That's cruel, but that's the truth. And the Air Force was disinterested too, unless I could pass the pilot or the navigator qualification test. And I thought to myself, there is no way I can do this. I've had no math, very little science, and I thought, I think I made the appointment. I went in and I took the test. And I can tell you today that the test was something that was beyond my wildest imaginations. There were pictures of boxes, oddly shaped boxes. And so you'd see the picture of the box here, and then you'd have 5 choices over here. And the 5 choices over on the right-hand side would be the same box, all unfolded and flat on the ground, on the table. And you had to decide which unfolded box was that one folded. Then they had pictures of instruments, and they'd show you an instrument with a dial, and the needle was pointing to one place on the dial, a numerical value, and then they would show you another dial that was similar to that, but the scale was different, and you had to decide which one of the 5 other dials was actually the same one that you would look for and looked at first. It was not particularly timed, although you had to move along because there was a lot to it. So there was an awful lot of spatial relationship kinds of things that I remember now, none of which made any sense to me. But the worst one that I saw, and the one that convinced me that I had no chance at all, was picture of a city from some elevation, and you could see a river running through part of it, and you could see the city blocks, and I think you could actually, I don't think you could see automobiles or people. I think the scale was bigger than that. Then the next pictures that you saw were pictures of the same city after it had been bombed, taken from a different altitude and approaching it from a different direction. And you had to pick out which picture it was that was the one of the first of the unbombed city. So you had 4 or 5 choices, and they were all different. And they all had a river, but you were all looking from a different direction. And some of them were taken obviously from a much higher altitude or and you had to pick the right one. I had no clue. I had no clue. So I figured that was wasted effort. And I pretty much decided that the Army was probably going to get me. And I got a call from the Air Force recruiter sometime later saying that I'd passed both the Air Force pilot and navigator test, which floored me. So I made the decision at that point in time to go into the Air Force. And I was signed, I took the oath of enlistment, on August 7th, 1968. A little other story I'll also add here, if I might. One of the things the Air Force did every time I saw them, and I saw the Air Force had to go and take the battery of tests went on and on and on. So you take some one day and then go back in, and this went on for several weeks, as I recall. And every time you went, you took a vision test to begin with. That was the first thing you did every time you went. And the vision test included a variety of things, but particularly a color blindness test. And everybody's had them with all of the colored dots, and you have to pick out the numbers in the dotted field. I got to know another young man my age at the same time, and he had wanted to be an Air Force pilot since he was a toddler. So he was very excited, and he was very confident and had been working hard at getting to this point. And the last day that we both went in to take the oath of enlistment, we went into the Boston Army base at that was and sat down in this classroom. There were about 20 of us. And the first thing they did was take us in and give us an eye test. And this fellow that I had gone through the entire program with failed the color blindness test and was out the door.
Oh, no.
He was brokenhearted. So I took the oath of enlistment, and at that point in time, became a staff sergeant in the United States Air Force with a reporting date of November in 1968. Coincidentally, that evening, I was married at that particular time, and was sitting down at dinner at 6 o'clock in the evening. I lived in Rentham, Massachusetts at that particular point in time. And the telephone rang, and it was my father calling. They still lived in Natick at that point. And he said, "I've got a letter here for you from the draft board." And I said, "Gee, Dad, it's too late. I'm now officially in the United States Air Force. But go ahead, read the letter and tell me what it says." So he opened the envelope, read the letter, and it was my occupational deferment.
Oh,
no. So too late. So I was on my way to Lackland Air Force Base, where I began to be a student in, let me see, it was class 6905, I think it was. And that was November. I reported in November of 1968, and I graduated 90 days later.
And Lackland Air Force Base is in?
Texas.
Texas.
San Antonio, Texas.
Okay. And how did you like basic?
Well, it wasn't basic as most people think of it. Uh, it was more like a very highly regimented, militarized graduate school. Uh, we were divided into flights, and I seem to recall now that I was in flight 7, but I'm not sure. Uh, I do remember our PT gear was yellow. We used to call them bunny suits. Uh, you went in a group as a flight. I think there were 20 of us, and we lived on one floor in the dormitory, which was a nice building, and I can assure you with no hesitation that it was immaculate. It was immaculate at all times, and God knows we cleaned, and but we would march everywhere as a group, and mostly it was classwork. We would go to lectures, and then we would have individual classes with individual instructors. The first 6 weeks, they taught us how to become an Air Force officer. They taught us how to wear uniforms and how to march, and that was the first 6 weeks where you're an undergraduate, and then uh, when you were upperclassmen, the courses became different, and to um, the pressure to be perfectly military at every moment changed. The heat was off you because there was an underclass now, and they were getting it. Um, I I found it challenging because I had already been out in the community for 2 years working, and everybody else in my flight had just graduated from college, so I was 2 years older, and I looked at everything a lot differently. Those 2 years made a big difference, um, and I became a student officer halfway through the first 6 weeks, um, and well, I do remember in those particularly the first 3.5 weeks, everybody got sick. Everybody came down with the bug or the flu or something, except me. I didn't. I was immune. Well, I'd been in a public school setting for 2 years, so I had built up a certain common immunity, and so at the end of those 6 weeks, of course, at the end of those 6 weeks, I had become a student officer and was going to have some additional responsibilities, and then I got sick, and I spent the best part of 2.5 weeks mostly in bed, hobbling, trying to keep up, um, trying not to be sick throw up on my shoes all the time and that sort of thing. But finally, I came out of it and did lose my rank because I couldn't continue the job, but that didn't really matter too much. It was at that point in time I was interested primarily in just getting on with it, getting out. And my parents flew out to San Antonio, and my wife flew out with them. So they were there for the graduation ceremony and the grand parade we had, and all of that. And um, so then I went through the ritual of driving through the main gate as a brand new second lieutenant, wearing my brand new gold bars and receiving my very first salute from the gate guard. That was a big deal at that particular point in time. After that, I went to Webb Air Force Base in Big Spring, Texas, and was in the student squadron, learning how to be a pilot. And that was extremely difficult. It was extremely difficult for me for the wrong reasons, perhaps. Um, in the first stage of student pilot training, we were assigned a civilian pilot who flew with us. The civilian pilot that I have no doubt, was an absolutely magnificent, perfect pilot. We flew the Cessna 172 aircraft as a basic trainer, although it was actually called a it was called a T-41, if I remember correctly now. And it had more power than a 172 had. I actually ended up owning my own plane while I was still working up here in Maine, and it was a Cessna 172. At any rate, in Texas, I was very uncomfortable every morning because we'd start to fly by 7 o'clock, and the pilot that was my instructor would get into the cockpit and usually begin by telling me that he had been out all night and he had been really drunk last night, which didn't really make me feel very good. And then he would let out these enormous belches. And at 3,000 feet in this little airplane, I can tell you it was very unsettling, and it was, I just wasn't getting it. It wasn't working. I understood what was happening, but I couldn't make it work. So after about halfway through, just before I was supposed to solo the airplane, I went into the squadron commander's office and told him, I said, it's time for me to do something else. I'm not doing well here, and this is not going to work. And I said, the Air Force can find something else for me to do, but I'm not going to be flying their airplanes. Well, he was pretty angry. And self-initiating elimination from pilot training is like refusing the Holy Grail. And so he was a NR4 pilot who had combat tours in Vietnam and had actually flying in the backseat of the airplane, had actually been part of the shoot down of 2 MiGs. So he was pretty contemptuous of me. But I had made the decision. I wasn't going to let them throw me out. I was going to recognize what I felt was the inevitable and find something else to do. I had a 4-year commitment to the Air Force, and they would find something for me to do. So I was put in a limbo status while I waited for a new assignment to come for me of some sort. And I had to report every day, and of course, there wasn't just a vacation. I was given chores to do of some sort. I don't even remember what they were now. But one day, when I reported to work, there was a message for me to go and meet the deputy base commander. Well, I thought, couldn't understand what that was about. Why would the base commander want to talk to me unless they're going to put me in jail or something? I can't imagine. Can't imagine what this is about. So at the appointed hour, I appeared before the deputy base commander in his office. He was I believe he was a lieutenant colonel. And for me, I was a second lieutenant at that time. Meeting anybody above the rank of captain was like being called before God. You know, really frightening stuff. So I had my very best tightly pressed uniform on and went in and came to attention 18 inches in front of his desk and gave him my very best salute, and hoping, and he looked up from his desk and said, I'm glad to meet you. Please sit down. So that was amazing. So he said, I understand you are leaving pilot training. And I said, yes, sir, that is correct. And he said, I also understand you have 2 years teaching in the inner city. And I said, yes, sir, that is correct. And he said, well, we have a problem. The headquarters squadron on this base is composed primarily of those young people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, primarily in the inner city. Our squadron commander has fallen ill and is not able to continue. And we don't have anybody, we don't have a new squadron officer programmed or available to us for some foreseeable period of time. It might be as much as a year or even two, which seemed very strange to me. But at any rate, this is what he was telling me. And he said, we were wondering if you might be interested in the position of headquarters squadron commander because of your background. And I was almost fell out of my chair. It was, I at first couldn't really even believe that I was hearing what I was hearing. The only thing I could think of while he was saying was a story that we were told by our flight training officer at OTS. He told us a story about, this was a little ad hoc lesson that we had out on the training field one day after we had been practicing marching, and we were standing around having about a 10-minute rest, and Captain Parker told us this little story. He said, it'll be very important that you understand how to get along and work with your non-commissioned officers, because they are the ones who translate your orders and your responsibilities into actual actions. And he said, I'll tell you a little story. He said there was a young second lieutenant who had been ordered by the captain to supervise the installation of three missiles in missile silos. And he was told to get the work done that morning. At noontime, the captain came back and he said to the lieutenant, well, what have you done? And the captain said, we've worked really hard, sir, and we have one of those missiles already installed. I think that that's pretty good. Don't you, sir? And the captain said, no, I think that's really pretty poor. And the lieutenant said, sir, how would you do it? And the captain said, Lieutenant, you see that master sergeant standing over there? If I had to get those missiles put down on the ground, I would say, Sergeant, see those missiles? Put those missiles into those holes in the ground. If you need me, I'll be at the club. I thought that's what I was thinking when I was listening to this colonel, and I was thinking, well, okay. I said, who's the NCO staff? And he said, well, you do have an experienced chief master sergeant, and he'll be there he will probably be retiring out of this base, and so you will have good support. And so I asked the lieutenant colonel if I could discuss it with my wife, and but I was interested. I had no idea what I was talking about. So I discussed it with my wife, and she said that it sounded like something that I should do if I could get the job. And the situation was that I've got a cat here that keeps trying to interfere. The situation was the Air Force, the base command would request of Air Force headquarters, Air Force, and Air Training Command to release me so that I could become part of their organization, and that was the decision. So they made the request, and some 4 or 5 weeks later, I think it was, the word came back that no, that would not be acceptable, and it was Air Force policy that those leaving pilot training would not remain on the base. Period. No discussion. So then I decided to try to find out where I was going to go, because I was getting kind of old, just marking time. And Michelle, my wife, my wife Ginger, wanted to make plans about where she was going to go, because we had a rented house and we were going to have to figure out what to do about that. Air Force would move her wherever we wanted to move to. So I called the Air Reserve Personnel Center and talked to the officer who was in charge of officer assignments. And he said, well, we've got three specialties that are open right now. He said there's munitions maintenance, avionics maintenance, and weapons control. And I said, well, I thought munitions maintenance, that's screwing detonators into the ends of bombs and that sort of thing. I don't want to do that. And the other one is avionics maintenance, and that's electronic stuff, and I don't want to do any of that because I don't know any. I don't have the beginning science to even get involved in talking about that. And so I said, what's weapons control? And he said, I don't really know. And I said, but let me look it up. So while I was on the phone, he looked up the job description of a weapons controller, and it sounded interesting. It sounded something to do with controlling airplanes in a tactical environment and different than being an air traffic control officer. It wasn't like that. It did not involve landing and taking airplanes off. It involved what happened to the airplane after it took off. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. I said, what kind of an assignment would I have? And he said, well, we have an immediate opening in. It gave me the name of the Air Force station outside of Houston, Texas. And I thought, I've had enough Texas for a while. I think I'd like to do something else. And he said, what do you have? What would you like? And I said, well, I would like someplace in the Northeast. Ideally, Otis Air Force Base would be terrific. But I'm a Northeasterner. And he said, well, we have Syracuse Air Force Station in New York. And he said, that's a Sage Direction Center. I don't know what that is. And I thought, I don't know what it is either. And he said, with Charleston Air Force Station in Maine. And I thought, I don't know where that is. And at North Truro Air Force Station in Massachusetts. And I said, I'll take it, sign me up. So when is that? And first thing I had to do was go to a 6-week school, an 8-week school in Panama City, Florida. And I went there in May and was there all summer. And signed into North Truro Air Force Station on August 13th, 1968, to North Truro Air Force Station. And I walked down to North Truro Air Force Station and presented myself in the headquarters building, and was promptly told to get lost for 3 or 4 days. The base was about to have an operational readiness inspection, and the last thing they wanted was to have a second lieutenant hanging around who knew nothing, because the inspector general was coming. The base had not passed an operational readiness inspection for years and years and years, if ever. And I learned subsequently that what was going to happen is they would fail this exam and the commander would be fired and retired. And there would be a new commander that would come in at about the same time that I was coming in. So I went back to Newton Center where my wife was living with her mother and father, and I stayed there. We went up to Maine, visit my parents for a couple of days, and then I went back down and signed in, and sure enough, I got there the day that the commander was having his farewell party, and I didn't attend, but I could see that it was going on. And I signed in to the 762nd Air Defense Squadron at North Truro, Massachusetts. I became a squadron weapons controller, and I was actually the senior lieutenant because I was the second lieutenant to be assigned there, and after me there were 8 or 9 other lieutenants that were coming in. This was the beginning of a big push by the Air Force to support the air war in Southeast Asia. So we got a new commander at that point in time, and the rumors flew around like crazy. This new commander was a full colonel, which was a little unusual for a radar squadron like ours. Most of the commanders were always lieutenant colonels, sometimes even senior majors. But we were getting a full colonel. More exciting than that, he was a World War II fighter pilot, and was also an F-4 pilot, who had already had 100 missions over North Vietnam. And so we expected this guy to appear who was about 9 feet tall and about 3 or 4 feet across the chest, with great big arms and able to leap tall buildings with a single bound. And what we got was a colonel by the name of Alva D. Heenahan, who was used to say he was 130 pounds on a wet day. He was about 5 feet 6 inches tall, had a rather healthy-looking mustache, and I remember crystal blue eyes and very piercing gaze when he wanted to be. And he was only about 5 feet 6 or 7 inches tall, but he might as well have been 8 feet tall, because when he wanted to be 8 feet tall, he was 8 feet tall. And he hated North Truro Air Force Station with a passion. He did not want to be there because they didn't have any airplanes. So he devoted his time there to making it the most pleasant place that any of the people who were stationed there and worked there could want it to be. He told all of us, officers as well as enlisted people, a lot of young enlisted people. We had about 220 young enlisted people there, many of them 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. And of course, North Truro in the summertime is right with its beaches and its Provincetown and all of the things that happen in the Outer Cape. Was a great place to play. And what Colonel Heenahan told everybody, he said, I don't care if you don't have any work to do, if your job is done and you don't have anything you want to do, you don't have to be here. Do whatever you want. He told the young enlisted kids, I heard him say this, told the young enlisted kids, if you're going to meet a girl someplace and get yourself into trouble, don't get into trouble downtown. Come back here and get into trouble. And so the atmosphere became lighter, and he said, I don't care if you're not here, if you don't have anything to do, but if I need you and I need to find you, I'd better be able to find you, or I'll get you with both feet. He used to say that. And so, okay, that's fair. Right. I don't think there were any problems. I never heard of any. And but there was a housing problem because there weren't any houses. And at that point in time, the National Park Service had about a dozen houses in the area that they had claimed as part of the gradual taking over large tracts of area and clearing of parkland down on the Outer Cape in the National Seashore. And because I was senior lieutenant, or I was the first one there anyway, I was first on the housing list. And so the colonel called me into his office and said, I've got a house for you. And he said, but you have to promise something if you're going to get it. He said, this house is on the edge of a cliff and it looks right out over the ocean. And he said, you can have it, but you have to promise that there'll be lots of parties. And I said, sure, well, we'll have lots of parties. We got to have a house. So we went down and looked at this house. It was about a mile from the base, down at the end of the road. The next stop was just the little parking lot and Coast Guard. I think it was called Coast Guard Beach in those days. And it was down. It was up a quarter of a mile road, and the house sat up on the dunes. And the view out over the bay was out of the ocean to Africa was breathtaking. And if I knew that if I stayed in the Air Force long enough to become a major general, I'd never have housing like that again. It was so wild and so windy up there sometimes that the record player, the needle on the record player, would skate across the record because the house would shake so much. But it was a wonderful house, and we had lots and lots of parties, and it was a wonderful time. I worked like fury. The captain in charge of the training office called me in after I'd been there 6 months or so, and he was brought into North Truro to change the entire training program of our operations. And he said, "You have 2 years teaching experience," and I said, "I do." And he said, I am creating the position in this office of academic training officer. And he said, I would like you to have that position. That's an additional duty. So I was learning to be a weapons controller, and then I had this other duty which involved arranging for the academic training of young enlisted and officers who are coming into operations and getting them. My accomplishment was I invented a method of taking these younger troops right out of basic training and sending them from graduation to technical training. So when they reported to us at North Truro, they were fully qualified to begin positional training, which saved the government money, and it also cut down the training time and the lag in training for personnel. So I became part of the regular combat crew because I found that I really liked controlling airplanes. We had a completely computerized system where you never saw the actual radar data on the radar scope in front of you. Rather, this was computer generated information. And the radar information that we took into the computer system that we had came from, I believe it was 10 different radar sites throughout the northeastern part of the United States. And our job, our system was actually called BUIC, B-U-I-C, which stood for Backup Intercept Control. And the way the air defense system worked, we knew that the main control center was Syracuse, New York, was the SAGE Direction Center at Syracuse, New York. And in a war, we knew that was going to be a primary target to take out, to blind our air defense capability. And we had two in New England. We had two Buick 3 sites, one in Charleston, Maine, and one at North Truro. And with the advent of a colonel in command, our name changed from the 762nd Radar Squadron to the 762nd Air Defense Group. And we would become the primary control and direction facility at time of war if Syracuse was not able to function. So once or twice a week, we went to level 4 operations in which North Truro took over responsibility for air defense of the entire northeastern corner of the United States. And we controlled interceptor aircraft out of Otis. There were interceptors stationed at Bangor. at Montpelier and Westover. We had F-102s out of Westover. And then we would have major exercises in which the Air Force would fly all kinds of aircraft in simulating a Russian mass bomber attack coming at us from the northeast someplace. And these exercises would take place normally in the middle of the night. And we would simulate positioning our interceptors for strikes against the bombers coming in. And it was very exciting. It was different than my basic training in weapons control at school had been, because this involved programming a computer. I had a technician that worked with me that actually did all of the communication within the operations site, but he also was responsible for inputting the commands into the computer that I would give in positioning my interceptors against the targets. We didn't have a round radar screen. We had a rectangular screen like a television set, and the computer would give us a history, a recent flight history of each track that we had, each aircraft, and so we had a very different way of looking at the radar picture than I had been taught in basic school. Like everything that was fun, they have a tendency to come to an end. And one of the first thing that I did when I got to North Truro initially, after I signed in, the first thing I did was I went into the orderly room and I put in my papers volunteering for Southeast Asia. And the reason for that was very simple. I knew that I would have a remote tour right after I got through my first assignment. That would be Iceland, someplace in Alaska, someplace cold. And I wasn't real interested in being cold. And the other thing was, at that particular point in time, I had changed. And I was actively thinking about the future of the Air Force as a career. And I had had too many good things had happened. I had had too many good experiences to want to just think about fore and out at that point in time. I was thinking about, I needed to see what the potential in the Air Force was. And I knew that the route to promotion and success as a career for me in my particular kind of work, controlling high performance aircraft, was to be where it was being done for seriousness. And so I volunteered. I had many people that I talked to at North Truro who had been to Thailand and Vietnam, and so I knew pretty much what to expect. And so I volunteered, and that meant that probably the best I could hope for was to be at North Truro for about 18 months. And my orders came down to Vietnam, and they came down at about the 15-month period. And but my wife was pregnant with our first child, and the Air Force policy was that you were not rotated to a combat zone. You were not rotated at all, actually, within 90 days of the date of birth of a child. So my first assignment to Vietnam was refused, and the second assignment that I came down sometime after that was to the 621st Tactical Control Squadron at Udon, Thailand.
Wow. Okay, so you didn't want to go anywhere cold. You're going to a hot place in more ways than one, because Tell us a little bit about the Vietnam War at this stage when you were heading off to Thailand.
The Tet Offensive was over.
Mhm.
Um, the air war was no longer, there was practically no combat activity, or very little combat activity in Vietnam. There were continuing airstrikes throughout Vietnam. We knew that. And so my assumption in leaving, because I had talked to people who had been stationed at Brigham Control at Udon, Thailand. And they had been stationed there when the bombing in North Vietnam was going on. So they were used to controlling tankers that would rendezvous with flights of F-4s, large numbers of F-4s. And sometimes there would be 2 or 3 tankers in a cell. So you would have a lot of tankers and a lot of receivers coming together at once to take fuel. And then you would wait and then be refueling those same fighters coming back, F-4s and F-105s. When I was expecting that kind of thing. I was going to Brigham, so I expected it to be like that. There were no F-105s flying active combat missions when I got there. It was just the F-104. And then there were various other aircraft that would go through the area that we would see, but we would not have to refuel them, and usually was a matter of just providing a flight following service for them as they transited our area at Brigham. It was quiet, and we had a lot of controllers. Brigham was the headquarters of the tactical air control system in Thailand. And so there were a lot of controllers and a lot of junior controllers like me who were vying for time to work on positions so that you could get upgraded to operational status. One day, I should say, I went to work, and the senior director, who conducted a briefing before every shift, we worked long. The shifts were long. We had 10-hour day shifts and 12-hour night shifts, 14-hour night shifts. So the nights were the longest ones, and they were very long because there wasn't much going on that we had anything to do with. The flying took place in the plain of jars, and mostly it was Air America, which was the CIA, and they were not flying fast-moving aircraft. They were flying helicopters, and so the most we'd ever see usually would be one tanker working in our refueling area, which was our primary area, which was called the Orange Anchor. There would be one tanker, and you might have 4 or 5 receivers that would hit it over a 3-hour period. So it was very quiet. And so everything was standard rendezvous, and the tanker was really flying its racetrack route, which was about 100 miles long by 20 miles wide. And it would fly this regular left turning route, 100 miles, and at the bottom of the route, he would meet his receiver, and then they would connect, and he'd pump fuel into the receiver. And by the time he reached the north point, the receiver was ready to drop off and go about his business. And might be 2 or 3 strike aircraft, but not much activity. But one day, we were told that Nakhon Phanom, which was a control and reporting post that was subordinate to us at Udon, was having an enormous trouble because of traffic. The bombing activity over the Ho Chi Minh Trail was becoming extreme. And those aircraft were flying a lot at night. There were a lot of fighters at night, and they were looking to meet a tanker in what was called the Peach Anchor, which was the aerial refueling area controlled by the Nakhon Phanom. And they figured out that they could move the Peach Anchor slightly west of Nakhon Phanom, and that would put it into our radar coverage. It was nearly the end of our radar coverage at Udorn, but we could see it. We could see aircraft flying in that area above 16,000 feet. And so it became pretty normal for the senior director to tell the day shift, if anybody wanted to work some extra missions in the evening, we could pick up the Peach Anchor and make it our responsibility and help the subordinate unit out by doing that. The subordinate unit was small. They didn't have very many radar scopes, and I don't even know how many they did have. I think they had 4, but I'm not sure. But we had a dozen or more at Uban, so we could have control very large air operations if we were called to. So I began to volunteer. As soon as I was qualified, I began to volunteer, and I went into at night after a day shift. I would go in and I would work controlling rendezvous in the Peach Anchor for sometimes 4 or 5 hours, and I accumulated quite a lot of rendezvous. And it was challenging because a lot of the times the receivers were almost outside of radar coverage when you first contacted them. And so you had to bring them in to control them, give them command vectors to bring them into the tanker at the appropriate place at the appropriate time. And if there were a lot of receivers at the same time, some of which were hardly visible to you, there was a lot of creative thinking in trying to make sure that everybody was going to come together safely. The one thing that a tactical controller always had to worry about was making a mistake that in bad weather, for example, where visibility was poor, might result in 2 very large airplanes coming together, which was frowned on, to say the least. And I can remember having dreams about it, where the radar, as it sometimes did, suddenly failed in some way, and you couldn't see everybody that you thought you were talking to. And we're talking about 10 or 15, perhaps as many as 20 airplanes that you're trying to organize and control at one time, bringing them all together in the same small place, keeping vertical and horizontal separation between all of them, and doing it at night makes it even more challenging than just in the daytime. I had one very near miss at Udorn when I was there. I was controlling the tanker in the Cherry Anchor. It was just after I became operationally ready. It was very clear in my memory. It had been a very quiet morning, and the tanker was going home, was out of fuel, and was headed back to Utapao, where was the tanker base. And he is flying south, and he was at 27,500 feet, 27,500 feet, which I believe was the correct altitude to be flying for the tanker. That was the tanker's return to base altitude. It was always that altitude. Flying north that morning was a flight of 4 fully armed F-4s. And they were flying a cardinal direction, I believe, of 355 degrees. if you were flying west of north, you flew at 27,500 feet. If you were flying east of north, you were flying at 28,500 feet. And that was so that if you had an airplane flying south and an airplane flying north, they would be flying at different altitudes. And so if they passed each other at the same altitude, they'd have 1,000 feet of separation automatically. We didn't control altitude of any of the aircraft that we normally talk to, except when we were refueling them. The pilots were all responsible for maintaining their own altitude according to the established rules. If you're flying east, you fly at even altitude plus 500 feet. If you're flying west, you're flying at odd altitude plus 500 feet. Well, the tanker, except when the tankers in the Orange Anchor were flying home, they were flying at 27,500 feet because they owned that block of altitude. Well, now we have these airplanes, these 4 F-4s, who were going on a strike mission, and they're going up to hit a tanker in the Orange Anchor, and they're meeting a tanker returning from the Orange Anchor at the same altitude. Nobody's wrong, everybody's right. The responsibility then is the controller's responsibility. So at about 35 miles, I told the tanker, I probably said something like, Orange 5-1, you have fighter traffic 12 o'clock, 35 miles, co-altitude. And the tanker acknowledged that they had the report. I told the fighters, Ajax flight, you have a tanker 12 o'clock, 27,500 feet. At about 20 miles, the F-4s called and said, we have tanker in sight. We see the tanker, 20 miles, co-altitude. So once they said they saw the tanker, that made them responsibility for staying away from the tanker. Air separation is their responsibility. So at 20 miles or so, I called the Orange Anchor 5-1, and I said, Orange 5-1, you have strike aircraft, 12 o'clock, 20 miles, co-altitude. Never heard a response. What happened was all of a sudden, the F-4 saw this tanker. They knew he was going home. And what they did was they split their flight horizontally enough so that they passed the tanker, but enough so that it was quick and it was a show. And so all of a sudden, the tanker aircrew, pilot and the co-pilot in the aircraft, all they see is all of a sudden these 4 F-4s go by co-altitude, missing their wings by what looked like about inches. Well, it probably wasn't, but it was quick. And so they filed a complaint on me, saying that I didn't properly provide separation and control. The next day I got called into the commander's office, and the operations officer, and he told me about this. And I said, I made all of the appropriate calls. I'm absolutely certain. And so everything you did was on tape so that they could go back and they could find out what had happened. And they reviewed all the tapes. And the only criticism they made was that I might have given one more bearing and range call to the tanker, but I was within regulations. What they found out later was that the tanker aircrew was a recently arrived aircrew from one of the Air National Guard organizations in somewhere in the Midwest, and it was the first time they'd been to the Vietnam War, been to fly in combat. And while they were, after they finished their job and had done their refueling and were heading home, they had been listening to Hanoi Hannah out of Hanoi, the English language broadcast out of Hanoi. And so they missed my radio call. And the upshot of that was they ended up walking for the rest of their tour. They did not fly again, I was told. So that was a rude awakening for me, and I realized how sensitive it can be very quickly. And frankly, I didn't even understand until that point, I didn't understand how that sort of situation could occur. I never forgot that lesson. About 3 months into my tour at Udorn, the operations officer called me in to meet with him one afternoon and said that I was being given an additional duty at the request of the base commander's office at Udorn. Now, the 621st Tactical Control Squadron was a tenant unit. We were not part of the regular command structure of the base. We were visitors there, essentially a tenant. So we had very little to do with the actual operation of the base. There was no reason for us to do this. What had taken place is there had become a cash shortage that was discovered in the NCO club. I think it was $2,500. It had disappeared out of the till. And there was going to be an investigation. And somehow the 621st Tactical Control Squadron was tasked with this, and the operations officer, for some reason unknown to me, chose me as the investigating officer. Well, that was, as I look back on it, on the experience now, is totally inappropriate. I had very little understanding of finances except how to balance my own checkbook. And it should have been a job for a forensic accountant or somebody, but I was given the job. And under Air Force regulations, an Air Force officer should be capable of performing any Air Force mission that's necessary. So this is an additional duty that I was given in addition to my normal crew rotations. So I went to the NCO club and I met with the cashier at the NCO club. She was a Thai national. She had been there for 7 years doing the same job. And she went through all of the procedures that she was trained to follow in handling the money, showed me all of the documentation that she had signed off on for every receipt that she had received, and showed me how the money was handled. She was very, very thorough and she spoke perfect English. And she also showed me her personal bank book from the bank in the town. And as I say, she had been there for 7 years, I think it was. And every month for 7 years, she had made the same small deposit into her into her savings account at this bank every single week. I think it was $10, so it might have been $5. So, but it was, there it was, and I thought to myself, I don't see how this woman, after 7 years, is going to decide to take $2,500. She's got more than $2,500 in the bank. Why would she decide to cashier her career and possibly go to jail for $2,500 at this point? What's the point? I also learned something else about the Thais. Thai people are very meticulous, careful, and very patient. Up to a point, they're very, very patient. If you go beyond that point, they can become very unpleasant very quickly. But basically, they're very benign and pleasant people. They have great sense of humor, are wonderful to be around. And I just didn't see how this woman was at all responsible. I talked to the American GIs who were responsible for operating the club, and I saw nothing. I saw nobody was uncomfortable. Nobody was defensive that I could tell. So I really couldn't see how money could disappear. I couldn't figure it out. And I had met with her again. And in the background of all of this, the person who was in charge of the overall, in charge of the NCO club, was the officer who was in charge of what's called non-appropriated fund activities. He was a lieutenant colonel. And I had to meet with him before I began all of this. And he was the one who began first to tell me it must be the Thai bookkeeper who was responsible. And he also told me the first time I met him that he was confident that I would, after my investigation, find her responsible. It was said very positively like that. So, and I met with him again after about a week, and I explained that what I had found. And so I went back to work. This was very part-time for me. And I went back to this lieutenant colonel again, and he said, "We have another cash shortage in the Airmen's Club, and I'm adding this to your responsibility." And so there's another $1,500 that's disappeared. And now I've got these two. So I went back to talk to the Thai bookkeeper again. And she's ultimately responsible for the Airmen's Club also. It all flows into the same place. And we went through it all again. Then I had to go down to the village in Thailand, in Udon. I had arranged to have some clothing made. And I went down to the tailor shop. And as I was walking along, I had this strange feeling in the back of my neck. It was a bright sunny afternoon. And I just felt something was kind of strange in the town. I had no idea what it was, and I stopped at one point and looked around and didn't see anything, and went a few blocks further and had the same feeling and turned around. And this time I saw about 100 yards behind me, quite a ways behind me, I thought I saw the same shirt on a man that I had seen the first time. And I thought, that's strange. There's a bright colored shirt. It's a little unusual to see. So I went a little bit further, went to the tailor shop, did my business with the tailor, and then came out, started walking back the other way. And as I came out, right across the street was the same guy. A man about probably mid to late 30s, perhaps early 40s, a little stocky, military looking, but in civilian clothes. And I remember the shirt. I can still see the shirt. I walked along a little further, and he's turned around and looked into a shop, and then turned around again, still across the street, now 100 feet behind me. I'm convinced I'm being followed. I'm feeling very paranoid, and got back to the base and didn't think very much about it. Decided it was my imagination. The next time I went downtown, it was the same thing. And I saw the same person, or I was sure I saw the same person. And again, I didn't think very much about it. A few days later, as I was walking off the base, I happened to join the same throng of people walking off the base at the end of the workday. And the Thai bookkeeper was walking along. So I spoke to her. I mean, we'd had half a dozen conversations at that point, and I knew who she was, and she recognized me. And so we walked toward the main gate together, and then she got on a bus and left, and I took a taxi to go down into the town. The next day, I had a meeting. Oh, the other thing was, as I was walking along with her, I was sure that I saw that same man again walking off the base also. He was an American, and or as we would call him a round eye, and he looked military, but not very military, because civilian clothes I couldn't tell anyway. So the next day I went in to see the commander of non-appropriated funds, the lieutenant colonel, to ask for any more information that he might have, because I was not sure how I was going to wind this up. I was not going to issue an opinion that the Thai bookkeeper was responsible. I had no proof of that. And so he said to me, because of your special relationship with her, I'm sure you should be able to come to some sort of a conclusion. What is the nature of your relationship with her? And that really made me mad. And so I got to my feet and came to attention. And I said, Colonel, I have interviewed Miss So-and-so exactly 7 times. I also ran into her as we were both walking off the base. And she got into a bus and left in one direction, and I took a taxi in the other. And that, sir, is the total amount of my involvement with her. And if you have another complaint to issue against me, then I would suggest you do so. And I walked out. That was the last I met him. About 1 week later, the operations officer, my operations officer, called me into the office in the morning. The beginning of the shift. It was 8 o'clock. And he said, "What do you know about Lion Control?" And I said, "Well, I know that Lion Control is having an enormous amount of difficulty handling their traffic load. They're getting operational hazard reports from flight crews on a regular basis. And it appears to me from up here that they have a problem with training, a problem with proficiency level of controllers, and perhaps command. That's my guess. That's the rumor that we're hearing." And he said, "You're correct." He said, "They are overloaded because the bombing activity in the Ho Chi Minh Trail is so intense that they have such a workload and they're undermanned, and they need one more qualified tanker controller." And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Since you are arguably the most highly qualified tanker controller in Southeast Asia at this moment, I am sending you permanent change of station to Lion Control at Ubon." And I felt my life going out of my body at that point, because they were getting regular hazard complaints. And I was thinking, that's a death knell. That's a death knell, because there's something really bad about the radar site. There's something really wrong there. And if I go down there, I'm going to be cut into the middle of it. And so I tried to argue against it, and said I didn't want to go. And I explained why I didn't want to go and so forth. And Major Allen said, "Well, nevertheless, you're the best we've got to go down there." And he said, "I'm sending you down there." And I said, "When am I going?" He said, "You're going today at 11 o'clock in the morning. There's a shuttle that flies down to Ubon. You will be on it, and you're dismissed." And You threw me out. That was the end of it. So I went down to Lion Control and got there at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and was met at the terminal by a couple of controllers and a senior director from UBAN, who took me to have lunch, and then we went out to the radar site, and I had a quick positional evaluation. They wanted to find out whether or not I actually could do the job. And then I was put on the crew, and I was sitting down in place at 6 o'clock that evening to take my first term as a weapons controller at Lion Control. And I want to explain the working environment the way it was in the radar site, because it's really pretty important. We sat in a completely blacked out room. The only light in the room were positional lights over the desk that was beside each radar scope. It was very highly shielded and guided. And there was a large plexiglass panel board in the front of the room, perhaps 25 or 30 feet away, that had all of the tactical mission data for the night and a map of the Thai area that we were responsible for, and the weather information at various sites and so forth. All of the information that we would need to know what the missions were and what the aircraft were coming to us, including tankers as well as receivers. You might have as many as 25 separate lines of information about the flights that you were going to be working with that night. And otherwise, it was completely dark except for the light of the radar scopes themselves. I don't know how well this will translate, but this is what the radar scope itself looked like. And on either side of it, there were boxes of that enabled us to program various kinds of information in that would enable the radar scope to identify each individual radar blip that appeared. Now, they might have as many as 50 different blips on the radar scope at any one time. And we were using a radius of 150 miles. So we had a total radius of 300 miles on the scope. And that 150 miles, this is this gives you a relative look at where we were. Udorn is in the center. Nakhon Phanom is in the upper right-hand corner, and Ubon is down low. You notice Ubon is only 40 miles from the Cambodian border. What I didn't understand when I got there was that the air missions that we were flying was primarily in support of AC-130 gunships, which is a four-engine turboprop transport aircraft, a cargo aircraft that carried 40 millimeter guns, 7.62 millimeter miniguns like Gatling guns, and they were flying against traffic on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which would be truck traffic and foot traffic of troops going south down from Laos into Cambodia and then into Vietnam. But we were 40 miles from the Cambodian border, and the airstrikes that would leave our refueling anchor, which at Ubon was the Cherry anchor, would be going over, and there would be an F-4 that would be accompanying an AC-130 gunship at all times. So there would be one F-4 aircraft with the 130. There would be another F-4 on the tanker or coming to the tanker, and then there would be a third F-4 on the ground. And all three of these aircraft would be assigned to one Spectre gunship, one AC-130. Now we might have 20 gunships working in the same general area in Cambodia, and so uh, we could have uh, we could have 20 F4s coming and going at all times, coming to the anchor for refueling and going out. So the first night that I sat down, it seemed like it was going to be pretty routine. I had my tanker in the orbit, and I was talking to the tanker and getting settled in. And then all of a sudden the aircraft started to arrive, and they arrived unlike anything I'd seen before. They came from all directions. And so they were all coming to these fast moving fighter bombers were coming looking for refuel with this tanker, and they were coming from east and west, and some of them from north, and occasionally there'd be one from the south. And I was trying to put them on the same tanker at the same time. So instead of the tanker flying a normal racetrack route, I was turning the tanker continually and turning the receivers continually to try to effect a rendezvous. The responsibility was to bring the receivers in between 3 and 5 miles, or between 2 and 5 miles in trail, and 500 feet below the tanker. You could bring them in 500 feet above the tanker too, but 3 to 5 miles, that was pass or fail. So they had to make the final turn and be on the same heading as the tanker within 3 to 5 miles. When both the tanker and the receiver are turning all the time, it got very challenging to try to make it all happen. These people are moving at 300 miles an hour. So, and of course, at the same time, you have to tell each other F4 where the other F4s are. And so it would be peaceful for a little while, and then all of a sudden there'd be a whole flurry of activity. Occasionally there would be an anchor that was activated that would be south of us. We had an anchor called the lemon anchor. The cherry anchor was directly north of where we were stationed, and it was within 50 nautical miles of Ubon. The lemon anchor was south, and it was out of the way a little bit, and then there was another anchor way down below that was called the hickory anchor, and occasionally we would have to control airplanes way down there, but that was almost beyond our radar range, and so it was pretty much automatic. They had to do most of it themselves, and they were heavier medium bombers, B-66s, and they had their own rendezvous equipment. So it was extremely busy. That first night was extremely busy, and at 9 o'clock, after 2.5 hours or so of talking continuously, I was looking around for a relief. I was looking for a break, because normally up at Udorn, you would sit on scope for maybe an hour, and then somebody would come in and relieve you and take your place. If you go out to the break room and play hearts, or have coffee, or read a book, or something else. Well, I looked around after 3 hours, and after having completed more tanker rendezvous in those 3 hours than I had been able to complete in a month at Udorn. And I'm looking for relief, and to my great surprise, there was none. There was nobody. I was the tanker controller, and I was going to be there until midnight. And it went on like that for another 3 hours. It was very busy. I had never seen anything like it. At one point, I always worked with one enlisted technician, this young staff sergeant, who was very good, and he had been there 6 or 7 months at that point in time, and really knew his job. His job was to talk to the senior director by telephone, who's on a dais up and back of me, and he was to handle all of the in-house communication. This is actually similar to the control for. This is not a great picture, but you can see the main plotting board way up in front, and you can see the way the scopes looked. In point of fact, we didn't have time to pick up the telephone and dial the extension for the senior director. So if the senior director needed to say something to to me, he would yell down to me from above. It sounds easy, but Thailand is very hot. And radar equipment, the radar equipment we used, the radar scope itself was called UPA 35. The scope had its own power supply and its own air conditioning unit inside its big box. So with 15 of these radar consoles, all of them with an air conditioning motor running all the time, plus this big building that had air conditioning that was keeping the temperature between 60 and 70 degrees inside at all times. In Thailand, the sound of the air conditioning was deafening. So we could hear the aircraft because we wore headsets, but without the headsets, it could not hear conversation with the enlisted technician sitting next to me unless I leaned over to speak with him. Oh, he would lean over to speak to me. The headsets we had only a left ear piece, and the right ear was kept empty so that he could come and speak to us. So there was a lot of yelling and screaming going back and forth from position to position, plus all of this ambient roaring noise from the air conditioning. And I have some hearing loss as a result of this, plus the noise of the air-to-air radios, which were not just crystal clear, there was static. And if two airplanes keyed their microphones and spoke at the same time, there sometimes would be rather horrific shrieks that you would hear through the earpiece. You have to take the earphone off because it would be quite a jolt. So it was extremely busy, and after that first night, I understood why they had so much trouble at that site with operational hazardous reports, OHRs, filed by air crews. It was almost a guarantee, and especially once the monsoon season began to roll in, it got worse because in the dark of night you'd have these big cloud buildups. And only by looking at very raw and untreated radar data could we really see any of the clouds. And a lot of times we couldn't see them anyway. The aircrew could see them, but we couldn't. So it was very intense, and it was exhilarating. Considering that I was never in physical harm doing my job, it was still terrifying. You can only do so much with your voice. You can only tell the aircrew exactly what you want him to do, and do it in such a way that he trusts you, because he may not be able to see. So he's taking it on good faith that you with a big radar see what he can't. The problem is, another problem here also, even though you have this big radar, the sweep that went around on the radar face, the line that went around, everybody has seen this, made a pass 360 degrees about every 12 seconds. Now what that means is every 12 seconds you are looking at refreshed information about a given radar return that you're looking at. But that radar return that you're actually looking at is 12 seconds old. And at 300 miles an hour, he's traveled a good distance. He's not where it looks like. So you're always looking to, as a controller, you're always looking in advance to see where you assume he's going to be. And that assumes that he heard the last command heading that you gave him. Ramada flight, turn right heading 010. And hope that he's done it. Because if he hasn't done it, maybe there's something directly ahead of him under the old heading that he could come too close to. And if the radio wasn't clear, there was too many people talking on the radio at the same time. If somebody was talking on the radio that shouldn't have been talking at that time, there are a lot of ways for commands to get lost. So that's essentially the the way that we functioned. Um, and there were some people that couldn't do it. There were some people that just couldn't do it. I only saw one controller actually froze on position. He just lost the picture. Um, he just had no idea what was happening all of a sudden. And it was the last time he sat in position.
So
And
how
I said,
long, I'm sorry.
excuse
So
me.
how long did you do this particular job?
Well, I was there for the remainder of my tour.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Interestingly enough, the investigation into the cash shortage um, after I never got finished by me. Uh, what happened was after I got to Ubon one day, I got called in to work on a day off, and I met these two rather large, well put together American men who promptly identified themselves to me as from the Office of Special Investigations of the United States Air Force. And they wanted all of the documentation and records that I had regarding my investigation, all of my notes, which I handed off to them and never heard another word. And that was the end of that. Then I became a squadron, just went to Ubon, and my only job on a regular basis, my only job was being just being a squadron weapons controller, and I did have an additional duty at one point. I became the briefing officer for the wing um, because the wing commander wanted all of the uh, elements on base that supported flying to meet new coming pilots when they came in so as a group, there'd be this meeting that we would attend to, and I would have um, 4 or 5 minutes to explain our role and how we interfaced with them. Our primary refueling anchor was within the 50 nautical mile radius, the terminal radius of the base. That means that aircraft within that terminal radius that are departing or arriving at Ubon are under the control of air traffic control. Air traffic control worked for the base operation. They were assigned to that. We were a part of the base. And we had no communication with them, even though we were half a mile away from them physically. We could not pick up the telephone and talk to air traffic control. In order to talk to air traffic control, we had to make a long distance call to Saigon and have it sent back to the base for connection to air traffic control. What this meant was we might be in the middle of all kinds of refueling activity in the orange anchor. We might have a tanker at 16,000 feet, a tanker at 20,000 feet, and a tanker at 24,000 feet with fighters coming in to hit all of these tankers at various altitudes. And at the same time, air traffic control could send, or approach control could send an aircraft off the runway of Ubon and head it and let it go north, flying directly through the air refueling area. I had this happen to me a couple of times. One night in particular, just as I was having refueling operations, I had only one tanker. All of a sudden, everybody started to yell at me about this airplane that flew right between them all, vertically. And I had no idea who it was. I didn't even see the radar return until after it was reported that there had been a near miss involving some strange aircraft that had flown vertically through my entire refueling area. Well, what had happened was the air traffic control had a Thai Air Force officer who had flown one of the Thai fighters, an F-5, from Bangkok to Ubon, and that he flown in that afternoon. And then in the evening, he was flying back to Bangkok. So air traffic control cleared him off the runway, and that was the end of their connection with him, because it was a visual flight rules war, and he was a Thai officer. He owned the airspace. We were guests there, and so he had no idea about our refueling operation, and I guess he didn't really care enough to find out. So he just went vertically. He left the ground and went straight up, and it was close. It was really close. Well, we couldn't find out if the procedure would have been, the problem would have been eliminated if we had had the ability for air traffic control to notify us, just a squawk box, just so that somebody in air traffic control could say, we have so-and-so departing north, that we would have been able to see him. But we had no idea it was coming. We had no idea. He was not squawking his identification code, his IFF, SIF, which all aircraft had. So he was just an airplane, and he just went right up through. So I was the controller, and when I got off my position, I made the telephone call to air traffic control through Saigon. It took half an hour to make the connection, and I got the watch commander at air traffic control on the line, who was a captain. And I told him, I said, this happens too much. I said, there's got to be a way that we can resolve this. Can't we get a telephone line installed? Is there something we can't do? And he said, look, how much time do you have left here in Thailand? And I said, 60 days. And he said, look, I'm leaving here in 3 weeks. He said, I think that our best interest is just ignore the situation and let whatever happens happen, because it's going to happen whether we do anything or not. Well, that made me mad.
Mm-hmm.
I had had a cross-training visit to Utapao, to the tankers, and I had gone on a combat mission with the tankers up over Cambodia. So I had a pretty good time getting to know some of the people and face to face at that point in time, including one guy that I had spent entirely too much time with in the officers club that night. And he was the deputy commander for operations, Lieutenant Colonel, and we hit it off really well. And so I decided I was going to head to call and talk to somebody. And so I called the wing headquarters at Utapao, and I asked to speak to this colonel. And as it happens, he was working that night too. He picked up the phone, and I identified myself, and I said, "You remember who I am?" And he said, "I sure do." He said, "Oh," he said, I still feel that." And so we checked a little bit about the night after my flight, and I said, "I have a story I want to tell you." I said, "This happens fairly frequently," and I said, "I don't want it to happen to me again. And I don't think you should have it happen to you either." So I explained the situation. And he said, "Let me call you back." So the phone went dead. And apparently he talked to the air crew, which had already landed. And they called me back. And he said, "I'm going to push this up the line." He said, "I'm going to talk to the wing commander about this within the next few minutes." He said, "You may not hear from me again, but I can assure you the wing commander will have more to do with this afterwards." Well, there was a big conference in Tokyo at that point in time, And my operations officer at UBAN was there as well as my commander and the 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 top two generals, 7th Air Force and 8th Air Force, I guess, and 13th Air Force were at this conference. This was a very high level planning conference. And the wing commander from the tankers at Utapao called his commander at 8th Air Force, Major General, I think Major General, and woke him up. It was about 2 in the morning or 2:30 in the morning, and woke him up to tell him about this incident that took place involving one of their tankers. And so that Major General woke up the commanding general of the 7th Air Force. And Major Generals don't like to be wakened at 2 o'clock in the morning. And when my operations officer got back, the couple of days later it was, the first thing he said to me was, he said, "What in the hell have you been doing?" And I told him the story. And he said, "Well, there's going to be a conference. There's going to be a meeting, and we're going to discuss, there is going to be a discussion about ATC and GCI, ground controlled intercept, which is what we were having some better communications method there is." And I said, "I want to go to the meeting." And he said, "No," he said, "you stay away. You caused enough trouble. Don't do any more." And so it never did. It all got resolved somehow, but after I was gone, because I was, one of the reasons that I did what I did that particular point in time was I was short. I was getting short-timed. And I thought, it would be awful on the last day that I'm here to find out that somebody ran into somebody else. And it's just not the way it should go. So that pretty much ends that. I went home.
Okay, so first, when did you leave Thailand?
I left Thailand. I can tell you my next assignment was January 3rd, 1972. And I became a squadron space surveillance officer at Detachment 7, the 14th Aerospace Force in MacDill Air Force Base, Florida.
And what was your rank at the time?
I was a first lieutenant, and I made captain at MacDill. And at MacDill, I was also offered a regular commission. Regular commissions were really a guarantee of a career. And regular commissions were given out at certain points. In my case, the earliest time for me to make regular could have been when I graduated from officer training school, if I had been a distinguished graduate, but unfortunately I spent 3 weeks sick and that wasn't going to happen. And so the next service. And so I had met the 2-year board and was offered a regular commission. And my wife and I were living in Tampa at that point in time, or actually living in Brandon, Florida, and we had had a new home. And but my unfortunately, I made a negative contribution to myself. And I've thought about it a lot, but I never became a good garrison soldier. I wasn't at MacDill in that squadron, which was something that I had wanted and asked for because it was involving space surveillance of missiles, and I thought that would be very interesting. And it was not. And I found after I was there a very short period of time that what I really wanted to do was I wanted to go back to Thailand and finish the war. I wanted to be there at the end, and it was not going to be very long. I knew that it was going to wind down, and tactical air operations would probably only be going on for another year and a half at the most. But I wanted to go back. Uh, the work schedule was impossible. We were very thinly manned, and I just didn't saw no future, and I was becoming more and more angry about it. And because I was really going to be trapped there for probably 3 years, and I thought to myself, I won't be. I wasn't sure I'd live through 3 years more, because it was just we were what the job was we were air surveilling the southeastern coast of the United States, and we were looking for submarine ballistic missile launches. And the problem that we had was the radar was really pretty primitive for that kind of thing and would lock on to all kinds of things and send a signal out. And we would have 30 seconds to 30 seconds, or I don't remember now, a minute or very little time to find out whether or not it was a real missile launch, or perhaps a flock of birds or something else like that, and then notify NORAD headquarters in Cheyenne Mountain that the signal that we had sent about a launch was false. And if we didn't meet the time, then all kinds of other things happened. And I just didn't have, I had a shocking lack of discipline toward controlling myself. So I decided maybe it's better that I just leave, which is what we did.
So when did you leave the Air Force?
Well, I left the Air Force in 1973. I believe it was May. I think it was May. And we decided that we were going to move back to Cape Cod. I actually had a job offer. If I wanted to leave the Air Force, I was offered a position in Friends Insurance Agency in Hyannis. I knew nothing about the insurance business, but we had had some discussions about this while I was still in Thailand, and I had taken a couple of insurance courses, and so I became actually what my job was. I was an agency manager, and the owner of the agency became a politician, was elected to the Board of Selectmen in Hyannis, which was a full-time job. And I remember the day he went to work, and then he came back in a couple of days later and threw the agency checkbooks on my desk and said, we had two offices. We had an office in Falmouth and an office in Hyannis. And he said, okay, he said, you're going to have to run both offices because I'm going to be really busy in town hall, and don't call me unless it's really an emergency. And so 6 months into the insurance industry, I tried to figure out how to run an insurance business. And so I found that I actually rather liked it. And selling intangibles, it was interesting. And we were almost entirely commercial insurance. And I was there for until 1976. And after that, moved to Maine.
And it says here you're also a member of the 101st Tactical Control Squadron for the U.S. Air National Guard. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Sure. Um, in 1976, my wife, my first wife, decided that she would much prefer that I live up in the woods of Maine and get eaten by a bear than be anywhere near her. Um, there were a lot of reasons for that. I think it's entirely possible that I've thought about this a great deal over the years, and I think the marriage was over. We changed a lot. I had changed a great deal. The Air Force changed a lot in me, and I also think that I may have come back with too much Thailand in me. I have no documentation for this, but I've heard and done a lot of studying about Vietnam era soldiers who have suffered various levels of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm not entirely sure about what that might not be appropriate to think about for myself also. So I will accept my responsibility in the dissolution of my first marriage. So I came to Maine because I'd always wanted to spend a summer on the coast alone, and so I had my chance. And then after a year and a half of doing a lot of different kinds of things to survive, a lot of my seventh grade shop skills from Coolidge Junior High School, I swear, put bread on the table more than once. And but I was my uncle, who was a doctor in locally in Ellsworth, and I'd always been fairly close to my mother's brothers, and I was having dinner with him one night, and we were talking at his home, and he said, "Do you ever miss the insurance business?" And I said, "Yeah, I miss the people, and I miss being able to talk to different people and travel around and see their businesses, and yeah, a little bit." And he said, "Why don't you start your own agency?" And I said, "Well, I don't have any money, and you have to have some money in order to start an agency, and not licensed and all of this thing." And he says, "Why don't you take your license exam?" And I thought about that, and I thought, well, okay. So I decided I'd look into it, and I made a call to the Worcester Insurance Company, which was a company I'd done quite a lot of business with on Cape Cod. And I talked to them and told them what I was doing and where I was and so forth. I said, in order to sit for my agent's license here in Maine, I would have to have a company support me to do that. The company say they will appoint me their agent if I am licensed. That's the legal niceties of it. So I took my license exam and became an insurance agent here in the state of Maine, and representing the Worcester Insurance Company. I also met some other insurance agents around who were willing to be cooperative and allow me to broker some business through them. I wasn't very lucrative, but it was at least an opportunity for me to do a little sales. And I was doing odd jobs and painting houses during the daytime, and then at nighttime trying to start something going in the insurance business. I was talking to an insurance manager in Portland it was the Peerless Insurance Company, and I'd gotten to know him on the phone quite a lot because I used to call him quite often to see if I could figure a way to get them to give me a license to represent them also. And finally, I said to him one day, after being told no for the 57th time or some such, I said to him, I said, "Do you know anybody who has an agency for sale?" he said um, in Ellsworth. And I said, no, I don't care if it's in Ellsworth, just so long as it isn't Washington or Aroostook County, because I don't think the insurance god has ever been to Washington or Aroostook County. And he said, well, I know of an agent in Waterville. It's an old time second generation agency. It's a small one. And he said, he's had some health problems. And it might not be a bad idea to have a talk with him. I'll call him for you. So he did. And I called and met this man whose name was Willard Gilmore on an agency called the Gilmore Agency in Waterville, and went up and had a meeting with him. And then he took me home to meet his wife, and his wife was the iron in the relationship, and I could see it as soon as I walked in the door. You know, if she was in uniform, she would have had 4 stars on her shoulders. She was a tough lady. So we had a nice long chat, and the end result was they offered to entertain an offer for me for their business. So, and I had no money, of course, so I had to put together a creative offer, which I did. And I ended up owning that agency, and then began to run hard to try to build it up. And in the course of doing that, met another had to hire a technician, and I had to hire somebody who was good, who knew it had to be a female. I needed a female office head because I had 2 other female employees, and I had to have somebody who was technically competent in rates and forms. And that was difficult to find. I was talking one day with an insurance field man who represented a company that I had represented on Cape Cod. He was the same field man who had worked the Cape Cod territory and now was in the Maine territory by coincidence. And I asked him if he knew of a technician who might be looking for a job. And he made a recommendation to this woman who worked in an agency about 25 miles away. And I called her up and set up a meeting. And after a negotiation, she decided that it was interesting enough. She was not from Maine. She was from away. Most recently had come from New York City, and her marriage, here in Maine had failed. So she was going to leave her employment and go someplace else. And she decided she'd come to Waterville and see what kind of an agency I was trying to put together. And she was extraordinarily good. And we spent an enormous amount of time together in the agency. She spent far more time in the agency working, making the agency functional inside than she really needed to do. And I ended up spending an awful lot more time with her because she was tremendous support technically for what I was trying to do. And as things developed, one thing led to another, and we began to become an item, and we married. And she was very supportive of and interested in my military experience, and I told her a lot of what I've told you. And one day she said, "How come you're not in the reserve?" She said, "There must be something." And I said, "Well, there's an Air National Guard squadron in sorry about that. There's an Air National Guard squadron in Worcester, and I can call them and see if they have any need or interest." And that was 1969, I guess. Um, oh, no, it isn't. Well, it might be. It might be 1970. Uh, no, it had to be later than that.
Mm.
It'd have to be 90. It would have to be 10 years later than that. So it'd have to be into 1980. And so I called the 101st Tactical Control Squadron, and they said that they had need of controllers, and so I went down and I had an interview, and then went in and joined them. So I was commuting at least once a month to Worcester from Waterville, Maine, and that developed into more than once a month, and sometimes it was twice. And I'd go down and I'd spend a night uh, for an exercise or to log some flying, some control time. Uh, and I deployed with them to a lot of different places. We went to Denmark, and we went to and I went to Italy as a major. I went to Italy on a NATO course. I was promoted to a major while I was down there. And but my primary job was really no longer going to be controlling airplanes. Had become an additional duty, had become my full-time duty, and I was the intelligence officer. And I deployed with the Rhode Island Air National Guard for a big exercise in Turkey, and we deployed to Alamogordo, New Mexico, for summer exercise and summer camp, and also went regularly to Otis for summer camps when we didn't deploy overseas, but it was usually every other year there was an overseas deployment, and that was fine. And I enjoyed the time. I tried to spend more time, but the insurance agency was getting bigger. I also bought another agency in Brunswick, and so there was that, which didn't have the agency very long. I had somebody else who wanted it badly enough so that they bought it from me. But I was traveling around the state continuously. My clientele was scattered all over the state, and it was all commercial, primarily almost entirely commercial insurance. So I was traveling sometimes 1,000 miles a week here in the state of Maine to see clients. And at one point, I had bought my own airplane so that I could. I was a better civilian pilot than I was going to be in the Air Force, obviously, and then I would commute to Worcester for my National Guard drills by my own private aircraft too. But by 1989, it was getting. I was having harder and harder time justifying going. I knew that the equipment that we had was so old and outmoded that it would never be deployed into a combat situation. I knew that I, at my age and rank, was never going to be deployed into the regular Air Force mission. And I was sitting around one Sunday after drill, waiting for the drill period to end. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and there were several officers talking together in the operations officers' room, and they were talking about when they had calculated when they were going to get their 20-year letter, that the letter saying they had 20 years of service and effectively could retire. And as I drove home that evening, I was thinking to myself that I was having a hard time seeing why I was there. I thought of my career and what I had done on active duty, and for that matter, what I'd done as a guardsman, and about the experiences and the times that I had had. And I thought to myself, strangely enough, you volunteered to begin with. You volunteered to go to Vietnam, and all the way along, these things you volunteered. It's nice to be able to come down here and put the uniform on again and participate. It's nice getting a nice check every month for doing that. That's okay. But the truth of the matter is, I never felt myself as a mercenary. I didn't do it for the money. I didn't join for the money. That's not why I went and why I did it. And when I got out of the car and in my driveway at home that night, I thought to myself, it's time for me not to do this anymore. 20-year letter or no 20-year letter, it's irrelevant. That's not why I'm here. And so that night I wrote the commander a letter and resigned my commission and walked away. And to this day, I sometimes think I'd like to find a way to do it all again. When the first Gulf War started, I was still an inactive reservist. And I felt when the first Gulf War began that there was no way that we should be doing that sort of thing. And I thought maybe I should volunteer to go back on active duty. I have a certain credential that I can use, not as a weapons controller, but I don't have the full qualification as an intelligence officer, but I do have experience working in a command post, so I could volunteer. And maybe some younger guy with 2 little kids at home wouldn't necessarily have to go at all. So I made the phone call and offered, but I was told that it's not going to be necessary. And so that was the end of it. And then not long after that, I was permanently retired, and I am considered permanently retired, so that even if somebody invades, they won't call me up, I guess. But I have no regrets. It has had a profound impact on me as a citizen and as an individual. And I'm glad I've had the experience, and I know that my service in time of war, especially, was credible. And lately, over the last 3 or 4 years, I have come to realize that there are not many like me anymore at all. The number of people who actually serve in uniform is very small. And it's hard for people to even understand what it's like because they have no familiarity with it. The military, they don't refer to, they refer to those in uniform as the military, as though they're almost an alien force that lives amongst them. I began wearing a veteran's cap quite frequently, and I hadn't done that until just a few years ago. And I also have veterans plates on my car now, which had not done until about 6 or 7, maybe 10 years ago.
Have you joined any veteran service organizations?
No, I have not.
Roger, is there anything you would like to add before we wrap things up?
I have a little story. I wrote this little story for Memorial Day, actually, that was published on Medium, and it's not very long, but it sums up how I feel about the whole experience pretty well, I think. And so I'd like to read it if you'll bear with me. I know this is very long, but
Go ahead.
Okay. One half of the way through my tour of duty in Thailand, I was entitled to take 30 days leave. The particular business I was in was very high stress, the hours long. I was exhausted, tired. Also, I had a daughter who had only been a couple of months old when I left. If I was lucky, I might get to be there on her first birthday. I really wanted to be at that party. The deal was that I could either fork over the big bucks for a commercial ticket to the States, a fee that on my paltry salary I could not afford, or I might be able to catch a flight on an Air Force transport winging its way across the Pacific. I could go that way if there was space available and if some senior officer didn't appear, pull rank on me, and kick me off my seat. As it turned out, the first part was easy. Everything clicked into place, and I found myself quickly on an Air Force tanker that had some passenger seats and was headed to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. Great. Well, almost great. The deal was that once I landed, I would have exactly 24 hours to catch a flight across the Pacific. After that, having no visa for the Philippines, I would be put on the next available flight back to Thailand, no exceptions. I now remember the heat, the stifling, still, humid heat sitting in that passenger service terminal at Clark Air Force Base. It made it hard to breathe. I could go nowhere because there was always a chance that some aircraft heading east would suddenly have a seat. The drill was you just sat there and kept watching the arrival and departures listings, hoping that you would be the first and fastest guy there when a seat opened up on some airplane. I think there were probably 200 or 300 people in that terminal, all waiting to go somewhere. A lot of them in the same box I was in, get a flight out of Clark or go back to the war. The same uniform I had worn when I left my home base at Ubon was really getting kind of rank by the 22nd hour. Planes had come and gone, but there were really no space available seats. So I just sat and waited. Soon the heat and humidity got the best of me and I fell asleep. When my name was called over the public address system, I awoke with a start at first. I didn't remember where I was. Report to passenger service was the speaker. Stiffly, I got to my feet and went to the big desk at the front of the terminal. There I saw this old master sergeant standing there wearing a coverall type of uniform that I had not seen before. It wasn't a flight suit, but it was some sort of work uniform in dark olive with subdued insignia. He had identified himself as from courier service. Are you heading stateside, Lieutenant? He asked. Well, yes, if I can get a seat. Otherwise, it's back to the war, I said. We need an officer with your security clearance to serve as a designated courier. It will guarantee you a seat all the way to San Francisco. You can only be bumped off by a medical emergency in Vietnam. Are you interested? I signed a whole lot of documents and was ushered out to a C-141 Starlifter. In the tail end of the fully loaded transport aircraft was the stuff I had signed away my life for, which would get me back to the States. It was a large pallet piled high with boxes, anywhere from shoe size to small steamer trunk. I was told the boxes contained classified electronic gear. But what this real story is about the other cargo on that plane. Along both sides of the aircraft were troop seats, 3 pipes with webbing hung from top around the pipe in back and out to the one in front, making a crude sort of seat. That's where I would sit as the airplane covered the miles. The others on that flight were neatly placed in front of those troop seats. Those others were in gray military caskets. Those passengers had traveled across the Pacific once before, but had left their lives behind. That trip was long, as it turned out. The plane's route was from the Philippines to Okinawa to Yokohama to Hawaii and then to San Francisco. Every time the plane landed, something that was broken had to be fixed, and we sat on the ground for hours and hours or days. All through the flight, I sat on the rock-hard troop seat, my feet stretched out over a casket since there was no other room for my feet. Every single moment when the aircraft was airborne, I wished to God there was someplace I could put my feet other than on some guy's corpse. I just saw the results of a poll regarding Memorial Day. The majority of people who responded said they believed that they were supposed to honor veterans on Memorial Day. I felt very sad when I read that. I felt it sad that so many Americans are so completely disconnected from their military. I felt sad that so many don't understand the service to the nation can mean dying for that nation. The memory of that flight across the Pacific Ocean burns bright for me even now. I don't really remember my daughter's birthday. I don't remember what I did with my wife and child the remainder of those precious 30 days. Those days I had away from war. I now only remember being aboard that airplane. I now remember those hard gray boxes carrying the remains of dead soldiers. On this and every Memorial Day, I remember feeling honored and privileged to have shared their last flight.
And with that, Roger Woodbury, thank you so much for, first of all, relating that story and for taking part in the Natick Veterans Oral History Project.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.